entirely neglected to think of the space age relation to the computer. And that was what I was talking about at the very last here. So we really have only covered the press conference preceding the time in which the people all came. And so are we,
I think you can go
we're
ahead.
on the air now, are we?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, after having the press conference, why, of course, the real thing, for which this was all preparation, occurred on February 15th, 1946, when the university and the ordnance people gathered together by invitation, probably around 200 guests, and had them for dinner and had them come over to the room in which the ENIAC had been built and was still standing there and operating, and a demonstration was given to these people of some of the things which the ENIAC could do, and that was quite an occasion for all of us, actually. The engineers and Eckert and I, who were the staff who built this machine, were at that dinner, but we were in the audience, sitting at the tables listening to the invited speakers. And as I remember it, the president of the National Academy of Science at that time, who was also president of the director of the Bell Labs for scientific research and so on, for the Bell Labs, he gave a talk in which he said he hardly knew just how to use a slide rule anymore, and he couldn't imagine what this machine was ever going to be good for. I think he meant that as a joke, but no one was quite sure how to take it. He didn't really, in this speech, I thought, do justice to the instrument which the ordnance people had produced, and it was a letdown for some of us. Well, be that as it may, why, when we went over to the demonstration, why Art Burks and others demonstrated in slow motion the things which the ENIAC could do, such as adding a certain number of numbers, counting and things of that sort, and then they put it in high speed, we'll say, and it was all over before you could see and know what you're seeing. These things were demonstrated to the audience, and we don't know how well they responded or understood what was going on. At the same time, we had, or rather just prior to that for the news conference, we had prepared a special edition, you might say, of the ENIAC with small frosted lamp bulbs in place of the minute neon bulbs for indicators of the numbers which were in these electronic accumulators. The reason we did that was because the feeble red light which was given out by the neon bulbs was not something you could record on the films that the newsreel men used in those days, pure black and white film, and it didn't know what red light was. So when we saw that that's what they were up against, why, Eckert said, well, you come back next week and we will have something set up that you can photograph. And so we put a lot of people to work rather quickly there. And the next week when they came back, well, we had little things that looked for all the world like lighted ping pong balls, but each with an Arabic number printed on it, or a plus or minus sign, for instance, on the part that indicated the sign of a number. And these things could be made to flash slowly or fast according to how the numbers that were put in were added, with that speed variation that I spoke of before, where we could run it fast or slow, both to check its reliability and just for demonstration purposes so that people could see what was going on. Because when you really ran it 100,000 pulses per second and added 5,000 additions a second of 10-digit numbers, why, that was too fast for anybody to know what was happening. So we did that demonstration for the newsreel, and of course that was to be released around the 15th of February, along with the news about the dedication, where all these people were invited. Well, we looked in vain at all the the movie houses. When the time came, there was no newsreel about this, because other things had intervened. The more important news was the Pope had made certain cardinals in Rome, and so that crowded out the event of which we were most interested in, seeing the lighted ping pong balls dance in front of a newsreel camera. So, at any rate, what happens after February 15th, 1946? Well, we don't just pack this machine up and send it to Aberdeen. With a great deal of planning and wisdom, why Dr. Goldstine and other people who had the care and use of the machine under their authority said, this machine is very useful where it is, right here at the Moore School now, and nobody can predict just how long it would take to move it. If we tear it apart and try to reassemble it in Aberdeen, it's going to take time. Who knows how long? Nobody knows. We've never moved anything like this before. There's lots of connections that have to be torn apart and reestablished. It's all been made in a very methodical way, and we think it could be methodically taken apart and put together again. In fact, the panels, which were 2 feet wide and something like 6, 7, 8 feet high, each one individually then could be slipped out the window into the alley and moved on down to Aberdeen. That isn't the way it happened, because first of all, they elected to keep the machine running and keep more testing being done and more use being made of it in Philadelphia, and it didn't move to Aberdeen till the next year. Secondly, however, what actually happened was they didn't take each panel and slide it through one of the windows into the alley and onto a truck and so on. Instead, they broke a new hole in the brick wall of the Moore School and moved it in larger pieces out this hole that they'd made, and then thereafter closed up the hole by putting a door there, because they wanted a door there. That was part of the grand design of this moving project, that we might as well make a hole there because we're going to want a door at that end of the Moore School to get to a new building they were building for the treasurer's office or something. And so a lot of people thought that it was a big joke, of course, that we designers had never thought about how to get this machine out of the building, like the man that builds a big boat in his basement and never can get it out. And we were in the same boat, you might say, but not so. It all could have come apart and all gone out the windows, but it was deemed easier, more appropriate or something to actually tear a hole in the wall of the building and replace that with a door later. Well, the history of the ENIAC thereafter, when it did get established at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, was, I'd say, a very respectable one. Altogether, it gave 10 years service before they decided that it could no longer be afforded. And the reason it couldn't be afforded, of course, was not because it used a lot of electricity. That was a minor matter. It's because it did use a lot of maintenance labor to keep check on it, see that the tubes were replaced proper intervals, and actually tested in advance so that you knew which tubes were going to probably last longest when you put them in, things of that sort. There's a long history of how tubes behave under those circumstances, which was piled up and later published by Homer Spence or someone in the engineering magazines. But in those 10 years, it did a lot of things. And they weren't all firing tables by a long shot. In fact, very few firing tables, I suspect. there were so many more problems waiting for that thing. And so the people with the wind tunnel began to reduce their data, which they were trying to get the drag on functions and how you modify the curvature on the shape of an artillery shell, whether it should have a blunt nose or a sharp nose and all those things. They did their research, and a lot of data reduction went over to the ENIAC to be where the numbers were crunched properly to tell them what they wanted to know about that. One of the things which went on in there while the ENIAC was at the under use at Aberdeen was it worked on some weather problems. I had nothing directly to do with that. There's an interesting long history about computing the weather, which is so long we can't tell it here, but in the First World War there was a man named Richardson who was a Quaker and decided that he didn't want to join directly in war but wanted to aid what way he could, so he rode the ambulances for the services and spent his spare time trying to figure out how a computer might solve predictions for weather. Of course, the only kinds of computers he had were the small mechanical desk computers, but if you used them long enough and had enough patience, well, you ought to be able to figure out in advance what the weather would be. Well, I said in advance. I didn't mean that, really. You could figure out from yesterday's weather what today's weather should be, but all he could do by actually figuring it out on that type of machine was to get the answer a year afterward. Now, this isn't much of a prediction, you see, but it's a real tour de force, you might say, in science of prediction. Is it possible? There's a question mark there. Is it possible to predict the weather in advance if you know enough about the weather today to make a good forecast of tomorrow purely by a lot of computation? The way weather has been predicted for many, many years was, of course, by drawing maps, and in the old days there were things called isobars, curves on the maps, and then a skilled and experienced weatherman looking at these would say, well, I think that the weather's going to move in this direction, this is what's going to happen, and more or less by techniques of guesstimates you would get a prediction, and sometimes it would turn out, sometimes not so good, and so forth. Could you do better with computing machines which are capable of accurate number work, where our theory is good enough so that with accurate numbers we do better than the guesstimates? Well, that's a big question, and he didn't settle it back in those days. He did his years or more work. He wrote a book about this, and it was Richardson's book on weather prediction. Sort of got lost in the libraries. It actually got lost at the Oxford Press, I believe it was. And years later then, when people began to get interested in this again, why, they reported they were all out of print. And then somebody says, no, we printed more than we've sold. How could that be? The rest of the copies were back in a storage shelf and had never been bound and had just been overlooked. They'd never put the binding on because that's an expensive part of book selling, book producing. So I think they're out of print again now, but I have a copy, so it was possible to get a copy at some time. So what happened to this ENIAC that it had any part in this? Well, the question was revived as to, now that we have an electronic computer, could we somehow do things like Richardson wanted to do and see a way to make the predictions come out, perhaps not fast enough to make them any use yet, but at least fast enough to prove it's possible. Because the the dim part of that Richardson story was that after he'd done his year's work, the predictions didn't check with what actually happened the next day in the weather. Now we know more about the weather and the atmospheric processes. We have a faster computer. Now it's time to reattack this problem. Well, the man who saw that problem as the next problem to attack in the weather and who got it put on the ENIAC was essentially von Neumann. It wasn't that other people didn't realize there was a problem in weather, because I did, but I didn't have the control over the ENIAC. I had no idea how to get anything done on the machine. I mean, I knew how to program it, you understand. I knew how to wire it up so that it would do things. But what was I? I was an engineer at the Moore School who had cooperated in helping to design this machine, but it was the property of the Army. So they would pick and choose problems that they thought were useful, and they did one on the specific heat of gases for an engineering study at Penn, and they did all kinds of other things which they thought would exemplify how good a computer could be for the science and engineering people to get ahead with their problems. Well, but as I say, I was interested in weather. This had been what brought me to the interest in faster computation to start with. So what was I doing about it now that we had a computer there over which I had no control? Well, what I thought was the sensible thing to do was I started going down to the Weather Bureau and to some other government bureaus where I knew that they could use faster computation, and talking to them. And in 1945, for instance, I went down and talked to them about this project, which I said would sometime be available and useful to them, I was sure. I couldn't tell everything. I couldn't really spill it all, because this project was deemed to be classified. From the very beginning, the ENIAC project was called confidential. Not secret or top secret, but confidential. No one, at least I didn't know, just how serious a classification that might be. What could they do to you if you slipped a little or something? So we were very, very careful about this. As far as we knew, we couldn't write anything, we couldn't say anything, and so forth. We had to keep it to ourselves. Well, that is an interesting sort of attitude to have when it turns out that this same Dr. von Neumann, who, as I explained, put this weather problem on the ENIAC later, suddenly appeared at the Moore School, as far as I know, as a guest of Dr. Goldstine. Dr. Goldstine had, in the years toward the end of the ENIAC contract, been assigned to work right at the Moore School to see that everything went well with this ENIAC project. Whereas the original assignment, they remember, was to expedite all kinds of calculations of firing tables. Now, at the end of the war and the end of the ENIAC project, why, he was doing his best to see that good use was made of the ENIAC. And so it turns out that in 1944, which we weren't right at the end yet, but Dr. Goldstine met Dr. von Neumann at a railroad station in Aberdeen. Von Neumann was a fairly regular visitor there. He was a government advisor on many different projects to many different services. And so he was part of the scientific advisory staff committees and things that worked with Aberdeen. And so as a result of their meeting, why, Goldstine told him about this ENIAC project and their work in high-speed computation, what we hoped to do in general. I, in my place, wouldn't have known what to say, because as a classified project, I'm not supposed to tell people anything. First, you have to establish the other person is cleared, and then you have to establish further that they have a need to know. Well, the situation in this case with Goldstine and Neumann was between them as to just who knew what about the clearance or the need to know. But I think it was well known by a lot of people that Neumann was involved in the Los Alamos project, the Manhattan project, that is, and a very high clearance for that. That he was working with the people in the Navy on underwater explosives or something of that sort. And here he was at Aberdeen and probably had a good clearance for that and so forth. So it was pretty obvious, I guess, to Goldstine that he could say something about all this, and he found when Neumann was very, very interested in this. And the end result of all this was that Goldstine invited him to come up to Philadelphia and find out more about the project, which he was anxious to do. We first heard about this sometime toward the end of August, I guess, that there was going to be an eminent mathematician going to come up there and talk to us, and he might be a great deal of help to us, because he was about the most eminent mathematician in the world. And, well, I knew well his name. I'd never met him. But his work in quantum theory and a lot of different things in the past, I was aware of these things. And so I was as anxious as anyone to meet this man and to find out what he could do for us. And so his clearance to come there to the Moore School, because it was a classified project, it had to be such, his clearance was arranged about September 7th, I think, for him to appear. And he came to the Moore School, and Goldstine introduced him around, and I showed him the two accumulators, which had already been put up as a sort of a model test of everything, and how fast they could compute. They could compute a little faster than Dr. von Neumann could, actually, although he had some very rapid mental processes which might surprisingly tell you what the last digit of a number should be, or something else which would amaze you if you didn't know a little more about the theory of numbers or some other way in which such a thing can sometimes be found. Well, he looked at our exhibit, and we were told to show him anything, talk to him, tell him anything, and so we then settled down in a room someplace and talked more in front of a blackboard, and then it was arranged that he come back further times, and pretty soon he was a sort of a regular visitor, and it seemed to us that he'd pretty well absorbed all the things that we had to say about how we were going to build something better than the machine that we were still trying to complete. The machine we're trying to complete, ENIAC, was not yet done in 44. It wasn't yet done in 45. It was just the end of 45 when we began to see the end of the road, you know, and do the Los Alamos problem. And so actually, the reason there was a Los Alamos problem put on there was because von Neumann, as a consultant to the Project Manhattan, had conceived that wouldn't it be nice to have a very nice big problem from Los Alamos tried out on this new calculating instrument. But while that was a nice thing to do, to try that out, why, he was really racing far ahead, speculating as to how you build better computers, because that's what we were talking to him about. We said, we don't want to build another one of these things. In building this and thinking about all the problems we've had, we've got much better solutions in many ways. So we have a way of storing pulses, not directly in vacuum tubes, and the information the way we did it with those digital counters, the scale of 10 things that I was talking about. We have ways of doing all this with a tube of mercury and some sound waves which get delayed through there, and then we use amplifiers and timing circuits and so forth, and we can store 1,000 pulses with only a few tubes, whereas it takes 500 tubes just to add and subtract and store one 10-digit decimal number, the way we were doing it in the old system. So we've got a lot of improvements, and we outlined these things. And von Neumann was a very apt pupil. He caught on right away as to what we're trying to do, and he volunteered to help, essentially. He would try to figure out a new way of coding instructions which might be suitable for such a machine. And we had explained that these coded instructions would be stored in these mercury pools, you might say, mercury tubes, as patterns of sound actually in transit through those tubes. And so all of this seemed like we were progressing very rapidly. And then he got called away. He had to go to Los Alamos to advise people down there on the Manhattan Project. And the next thing we knew, why, Dr. Goldstine came in waving an envelope and saying, well, I got a letter from Johnny today. Johnny von Neumann, everybody called him Johnny. And I got a letter from Johnny, and in it was a big write-up, a manuscript. He has written up all the things that we were talking about to save you the trouble. And so I'm going to have these things mimeographed, and we'll distribute them to the engineers, and so all of you can profit by the fact that Johnny has acted as a scribe or secretary here, writing up the stuff for us. So he did that. He mimeographed the set of papers, ran 40 or more pages of typewritten material, and we each got a copy. Now, I can't remember now distinctly whether the original copies that we got said on the front page by Dr. von Neumann or not. Well, perhaps they did, but that seemed okay, you know, that he'd written up something, so here's his name on it. And we engineers were going to profit from this. So each of us took the copy that we were given and started reading it. The only thing that I was bothered by was the fact that one place in the whole thing, there was a little footnote that said, I am indebted to this idea, for this idea, to Dr. John W. Mauchly. And there was another place in the whole thing in which that manuscript said, I'm indebted for this idea to J. Presper Eckert. This is what Shakespeare calls damning with faint praise or something. If he really meant it that way, why, who was supposed to be the originator of all the other ideas in this thing? He didn't say. And it's not known to this day, you might say, just the who's and the what's and everything about this, because, as you can find in a book by by Goldstine, who wrote a history after von Neumann's death, why von Neumann never was intending that that manuscript be published, and he had not corrected it or done anything to it to ensure proper credit for anyone else. It needed a lot, said Goldstine, before it would be ready for publication. But darned if Dr. Goldstine didn't go and effectively publish it without our even knowing it. We thought these 12 copies or so for the engineers were all the copies that were necessary. We were getting a private collection, private edition. It was months, I don't know how long later, we finally learned that he had distributed these things to people in England. And God knows where else, I don't know. Because the Moore School does not have a list of where all the copies went. The copies were never numbered, they were never classified, they were never anything else. Here was material which, as far as we knew, was classified. Nobody ever told us it wasn't. We were under prohibitions which we felt very deeply, that we should not write or tell anybody about what we were doing. But other people with other ideas, including Dr. Goldstine apparently, felt that this could be safely divulged to a lot of people in the world, in spite of the fact, of course, that these ideas had also been, well, we'll say, committed in another way. That is, we were told at the beginning of our contract with the Moore School, or with the government's contract with the Moore School, I should say, that we have the patent rights to exploit any of these inventions that might accrue in a commercial way, as long as the government got rights to these patents. Well, you can't just distribute and publish things like this and continue to maintain patent rights. That isn't the law of patents in this country. So there was something that we couldn't understand there either, you see. Well, there was some other questions about how the university could fulfill its obligations under its contract with the Ordnance Department to transfer to them the patent rights when there was no agreement with anybody as to how the university would get the right to transfer them. So Eckert and I did have some problems in that general time period, trying to work out with the university how we could pass to them the rights which they needed to give to the government, and yet retain the rights which we understood were to remain with us for commercial exploitation, as they call it. Well, we'd gotten this all worked out, an agreement between us and the university, that the university would be properly supplied with the patents so they could not only license the government, but license other institutions of character similar to theirs, as Dr. Pender called it, eleemosynary institutions. He loved that word. And Dr. Pender was dean of the Moore School and had a hand in arranging this agreement. Well, that was all in the past as far as we knew in 1945 into 46. And we didn't know there was anything else to worry about. We had this nice write-up from von Neumann. We thought we knew pretty darn well what we were going to do in the next computer to decrease the number of tubes required and to increase the capacity of the storage and to make it easier to program, and so on and so on. We were going to go to magnetic tape recording, which we'd had to avoid in the interests of getting the first machine, the ENIAC, done quickly. We were going to store our programs in the same kind of storage we stored data in, because now we had an economical form of storage. And we had a lot of things that we knew we were going to do, and it just remained, you might say, to get the funding for this. And the only step we'd been able to make so far was that while we were still working toward the dedication of the ENIAC, we were also involved in writing a report on what was now called the EDVAC, this new machine, the EDVAC, which would use these mercury tubes, sound wave devices, which came incidentally out of work which had been done in radar for the radiation laboratory. The idea having been in part then developed by Eckert and others to help the radar effort, now became adaptable through new inventive ideas applied to it to act as a storage for a computer. And so with this, we were going to build what we call an electronic discrete variable automatic calculator, EDVAC. And so we wrote a report about this. In that report, we had to acknowledge that in addition to all the other people that contributed, that there had been one more contributor now. Von Neumann had studied an order code which might be possible as a particular way of storing the information, and he had experimented with how appropriate that order code might be for certain problems. That order code, of course, never was used in any existing or any future machine. It wasn't used in the machines built at Princeton under von Neumann's direction later. It was just an experimental code which he had put together at the time to try out possibilities of certain ways of programming this machine. But the idea that we would store the programs inside the same storage where we stored the data was, as far as we're concerned, way, way back in our history, because there exist written disclosures which occurred in January 1944, which showed our intent to do this. We have Harry Huskey's comments that he understood that when he came on the ENIAC project, which when we were starting to talk about the EDVAC, he heard about that when he came on in April or so, 1944. So it hardly seems credible at first to have Dr. Goldstine, who was there on the scene, saying that the stored program idea was due to Dr. von Neumann. Well, as a matter of fact, he never did say that. If you look at Dr. Goldstein's history, he never said that von Neumann did the stored program, had the stored program idea first. He even quotes in his book the affidavit which Dr. von Neumann took at the occasion when they were investigating whether he was owed any patents, had any patentable ideas which he contributed to these things. And it seems as if his ideas were just several in number, like when you execute the instructions, take them in sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, rather than any other way, except when you have a jump instruction, essentially. Well, that seems to be a pretty logical thing to do. We'd never thought we'd do it otherwise. So anyone who wishes can examine those affidavits and see what they see as the contribution of von Neumann. What Dr. Goldstine actually claims, if you look at carefully, is that he contributed a certain logical clarity to the explanation of how you build a computer, and that was the essence of what he was writing up, and the first thing which Goldstine had so carefully circulated widely, and that was the essence of what is in a later a publication in 1948, I think it is, by Goldstine and Burks and Neumann. And so it's purely a misapprehension and misnomer on the part of many, many people who have somehow jumped to the conclusion that the stored program idea originated with von Neumann. This is, in fact, known in science as the Matthew effect. There's an article in the American, the AAAS journal, Science, called something about the Matthew effect, about how many different discoveries and inventions and things were attributed to someone who had the biggest reputation at the time, but the person that really did it. Well, at any rate, the thing is that from the time that von Neumann appeared in September 1944, to the time that we had this dedication of the ENIAC in 1946, there were certain strains and stresses on all of us working at the Moore School which were peculiar. They didn't really help to advance the work any, but they did happen and explain how the history turned out, really. Because what happened was that more and more von Neumann decided that he wanted to have a computer at the Institute for Advanced Study, which was his home base. And when the war was over, why, the interesting thing, of course, was to put all his effort into getting a computer at the Institute for Advanced Study. For Eckert and me, we thought the interesting thing would be to have this new idea of ours, the EDVAC, built and tried out and operating and useful at the Moore School, that we could see a great center of computational science, if you like, centering around the Moore School. If we could just go ahead and get funding for that kind of a project right there. Unfortunately, when we asked Dr. Pender what could he do about funding the project, he said, well, I don't know, maybe the American Philosophical Society. Well, I'd never heard of them as being a source of great funds. So that didn't sound too realistic to me, but of course I wasn't a member of the American Philosophical Society, so how would I know? So I thought, well, it seems to me that the government is still the big source where you can go. During the war, it was the military. Okay, we did the first computer, the ENIAC, with funds from ordnance. Now the war's over. It probably isn't the military we should go to, probably someone else. My friends were in two places, the Weather Bureau and the Census Bureau. I've explained I was interested in weather all along. I also said something about statistics and my interest in the use of that. Well, that brought me in contact through the statistical societies with a lot of people who were working in the Census Bureau, because they had to use statistics in many ways to try to cut down the amount of money that would be spent to achieve certain results in sampling to get what the population trends were and all the figures that the Census Bureau is very properly the source of. And so I thought, well, I've been to the Weather Bureau, now I'll go to the Census Bureau. And I went down to the Census Bureau, and I found that my friends there were very interested. They were receptive to the idea, and they said they'd try to do something more about it. And so Dr. Maddow guaranteed that he would stir up something, you might say. He'd have an answer for this pretty soon. Actually, I got in contact with him first, I think, because his wife was also a statistician, Lillian Maddow, and she had happened to work at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory in a position which was close to one that I was filling on a sort of part-time basis. I was down there serving as a statistician because of the fact that I could get no assurances from the Moore School that I would have a job thereafter. I was trying to keep a few irons in the fire so that if things turned out very badly at the Moore School, I could have another place to go. And so in 1945 here, I was at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory serving as a statistician advisor. Well, the Maddows did quickly summon the other people at census, and their names are among the most celebrated mathematicians of the world, actually. And they all met with me and later with Eckert to find out what could be done to build some kind of a computing machine for census. Still, even at that time, we were hampered by the fact that the computers that we'd been talking about and working on were supposedly classified. Nobody had relieved us of that burden. We would occasionally get sort of rumors, you might say, that, oh, that's been declassified. Well, just what has been declassified? Well, it would turn out that the pictures had been declassified, but not the circuits, or things of that sort, you see. So the only strange thing that we knew was that nobody had gotten in hot water by publishing anything yet. Certainly von Neumann hadn't. And secondly, Dr. Birx, about the time that he left the Moore School and decided to go up to Princeton at the invitation of von Neumann, he published an article in an electronics journal giving some of the circuits for the working of the ENIAC's adders and accumulators and things. So with that much precedent, one was very much in doubt as to just what was classified and what wasn't. The lawyers told us the circuits are classified. Some of them said, well, it's only the part that the signal corps is interested in is classified, that they think they have interest in counters or they have interest in something else and they don't want to declassify that, and so forth. It was a very messy subject as far as I was concerned. We thought our best bet was not to publish anything. Frankly, I was scared to. And so I would watch and see that, yes, there's a report in MTAC, Mathematical Tables and Aids to Computation, published at Brown University, a journal which tried to keep up with all kinds of computing equipment and computing tools and computing books and so on. They had a picture of the ENIAC and some description of it, what it would do. A leading mathematician from England had been invited over by Dr. Hartree to try problems on the ENIAC. This was Dr. Douglas Hartree from Cambridge University, who'd come over to put on some problems in laminar flow and boundary layers and things. And apparently he was happy and satisfied. My present wife helped him in putting the problem on the ENIAC. And so everything there seemed to be smooth enough, and he went back and eventually, of course, published a paper which had to do with the work he'd done in the ENIAC. He also published a paper which described and gave pictures of the ENIAC. Not of the circuits, you understand, but just the front panels and the cables and things showing what kind of a beast it was. And then a description which told some of the functions it fulfilled, what it was capable of doing, not circuits. So that much publication, fine. But what else could we do? We didn't know. It was just a no man's land for us, a potential bog in which we might easily get tripped or bogged down. So anyway, that's the easiest way out, not to publish, it seemed, because we were so busy trying to figure out what are we going to do next. The Moore School didn't seem to have any funds. For a while I thought they were, because the Army Ordnance people were going to fund the EDVAC project and started to fund it at the Moore School, and so there would be a team there that might do this. But it was clear that the there were forces pulling us toward Princeton in two ways. The Institute of Advanced Study was very close to the RCA laboratories over in Princeton. And Dr. von Neumann started talking about how he would have the help of the RCA laboratories and Dr. Zworkin's people in trying to build a machine up there. This would be an attractive feature for us to go up there and help him with getting this computer for the Institute. Well, the only trouble with that attraction was that Dr. Zworkin told a different story. When he talked to me about coming up to join the RCA laboratories, why, he sort of talked as if the whole show was in his laboratory. Wouldn't it be nice because of the fact that Dr. von Neumann had volunteered to be a help to us? And further, when I said, well, that's nice, and just where do the patents lie? Well, of course, everything gets assigned to RCA. That's always the practice. So we felt, Eckert and I, that maybe our future didn't lie at the Moore School, maybe it didn't lie with RCA, and maybe it didn't lie at the Institute for Advanced Study. And we began thinking more and more about what were the possibilities of trying to go in business and build something for the Bureau of the Census. It sounded as if the Bureau people were interested. I can't remember what date, but they did finally get clearance and so forth and came up and looked at the ENIAC. Meanwhile, we'd had other peculiar effects working on all this in that, mind you, before the announcement, the public announcement that there was an ENIAC came out, all that ordnance publicity and so on, there appeared in the New York Times a story about a machine which was going to be built, or at least proposed, by RCA, and Dr. Zworkin, and Dr. von Neumann. They had proposed it to the Weather Bureau in a sort of closed session. But the New York Times had found out about it, and they published the details of it as far as they could learn them. And this read word for word like the stuff that I was writing in my EDVAC report, which was supposed to be confidential. What was I to think? Here we were being very careful in 1946 to keep the secrets for the Army, not only with respect to military secrets, you might say, and things affecting the national interest, but also to keep their public relations secrets. We weren't even telling anybody there was such a machine till they had made an announcement. And here it says, these men had been down to Washington and had proposed this machine to work on weather. This was ultra curious because of the fact that I, of course, had told Dr. von Neumann and Goldstine and others that we had been to the Weather Bureau. We had talked with them about the possibilities. It was also curious from my point of view that having having been there, that the people at the Weather Bureau wouldn't have said to von Neumann and Zworkin, this sounds strangely like what we heard before from Dr. Mauchly. So at that point, in February 1946, I hied myself on a train up to New York to find out whether the New York Times was going to publish any more, and I found out either they weren't or at least they wouldn't. They gave me their assurance that there were no further articles coming out on this. Then I hied myself down to Washington to find out where the leak had occurred down there. And the man that investigated this was my good friend, the Chief Reichelderfer of the Weather Bureau. And he says, I don't know. He says, just what happened, but I'll find out. And what he found out was that they had gotten a news tip, the New York Times had gotten a news tip from RCA Public Relations in New York that there was a story to be had. Go and get it. And pointed to some particular people who'd been at that meeting. Then I went to the people that had been at the meeting to whom I'd talked, you see. Dr. Harry Wexler, who is now deceased, but he was then the research man at the Weather Bureau. And he said, well, of course this all sounded strangely familiar, John. Of course I thought that this sounded just like what you had been hinting at. You didn't tell me as much about it as they did. You didn't say anything about how many tubes or how much floor space or all the other things that they were telling us. But I knew that you told me what you were talking about was classified, and so there was nothing more you could say. And so I felt that I couldn't say any more either. Incidentally, when Goldstine called up Neumann and said, what's happened here? And I see this article in the New York Times. Goldstine says, Neumann said, well, I don't know what happened. There wasn't supposed to be anything in the paper about it. He says, a reporter called me up and asked me, and I said, no comment. I couldn't talk about it. So we see we're all keeping secrets in one way or another. So, with that kind of a peculiar situation going on, why, into the middle of all this stepped Dr. Irvin Travis, the man who had offered the courses on computer theory, which I'd read about and wanted to take before the war, and who had been away at the Ford Instrument Company as a Navy inspector or something and reserve officer's duty. Now he'd come back to the Moore School. He had a right to have his job back by the usual protocol. He could again be a professor at the Moore School. Seeing what had gone on there, apparently he must have told Dr. Pender that he had a little different idea. This is speculation as to what he did tell Dr. Pender, but the net result was that all of a sudden we were told all of the computer research and all kinds of research projects at the Moore School from now on are under Dr. Travis, Director of Research. The next thing we were told was, Dr. Travis wants to see you. Next thing, when we see him, he says, I don't want any more of this nonsense that we've been having about patents and all that stuff, so I want you to sign these agreements. He said, well, the patents are no issue. We've signed a patent agreement with the university. It's all settled. Don't worry about it. He says, no, it isn't all settled from now on. If you want to continue to work here at the university, you must sign these agreements. Well, the substance of the agreements were that Eckert and I would work for contracts, a year-to-year renewable thing, for a stated fee, which was a stated salary, which wasn't much, and that we would do no consulting outside. All our work would be the property of the Moore School, the patents would be the property of the university, and so on. And everything we thought we had gained by rather unseemly struggles before that, trying to settle things with the university about who got what, suddenly was shot up. He said, by 31st of March, I want your answer. We said, you can have it now, but he got the answer anyway. When he perceived the answer, I don't know, but the answer was, that was our signal to leave, that we were not going to do that. And immediately thereafter, of course, we hurried down to the Census Bureau to see what we could get in the way of funding. And for the first time then, we were talking about funding a new company, namely us. Whereas before we thought we were trying to get contracts where the Moore School could get a contract and carry on work which would be to the advantage of everyone. So that's how things happen. And of course, a year later or so, we found that there were other people playing with the Moore School project, such as Travis had a man from a Reeves Instrument in there to try to learn what the projects were finding out about computers and how to build computers so that Reeves Instrument could get in the business. He had just, in fact, advised Reeves Instruments not to finance us because it was too risky a business. So there were a lot of peculiarities in there. And the net result in the long run was that Travis got contracts from Burroughs, and then the next thing you know, he was a vice president of Burroughs, and is still receiving his salary there. I guess he's in retirement now. But through all of this, why, Dr. Pender was interested and somewhat sympathetic, I guess, with everyone, but he was not the strong person who would take sides in such a thing, apparently, at that time. I might say, sort of in retrospect, that when I first came to the Moore School, I thought that Dr. Pender was a real phenomenon which I would just wonder at for the rest of my life, and I guess I still do, because here was a man who had proved one of the fundamental facts about electricity under Professor Rowland, who was the first physics professor at Hopkins. And here was one of the first PhDs graduated from Hopkins in physics, who became this dean of engineering up at the Moore School.